Okay? Yeah. All right. Let's review a little bit. In fact, quite a bit will be reviewed tonight. This whole sub-series on Shakespeare is called Love and the Law. We're looking at 4 different plays. We're trying to understand the concept of grace and the concept of cause and consequence. We began with Romeo and Juliet. And through Romeo and Juliet, we looked at some ideas about polarity. In specific, we looked at the polar quality of cause and consequence. And we also looked at extremely foundational issues of cause and consequence by asking some basic questions. And I did that on purpose because cause and consequence is something that we all think we know, when we may not. And by looking at those tentative propositions as far as we got, we came to some very introductory answers about the nature of cause and consequence. We're going to review them tonight, and the review is going to be unlike the original, so it'll be one of those reviews that's totally different. But before that, we have to pick up from where we left off last time at the end of the reading. We were looking at justice and human law in its relationship to divine law. So let's begin there. Last time we asked the question, why have human law at all? And the answer to that was very paradoxical. We said that we have human law because we are free. We're free, and therefore we have the right to self-governance. And we have the duty to align our behavior with the rest of nature, or with the rest of the cosmos. Some people define freedom as being free from something. It's usually a Scorpio definition of freedom. I'm free from that. I don't have to have that responsibility anymore. And that idea of freedom is that we are free, and if we are free, we don't have to do anything. We don't have to answer to anyone. Now, there are whole philosophies that take that idea of freedom and they relate it to the whole cosmic process and to enlightenment. And in a way, that freedom from argument is somewhat cosmic escapism. That kind of philosophy is often stated, if I become enlightened, I can enter into a state of bliss and transcend the limiting conditions of the law, and I can leave this all behind. Sounds beautiful, but it usually doesn't work that way. Because when one transcends self, even the higher self, which is the home of our causal agency, one enters into a state not only beyond the law and beyond self, but one enters into a state of complete unity, where there is no division into cause and consequence. In that unity, which we express or which we experience intuitively, when we have a moment of pure intuition, it's timeless. It is a cosmic moment, and we understand the truth even apart from the circumstance in which the truth is manifest. But when we experience that eternally, we are indeed above the law, but we experience something more. In that unity, it's experienced not as only as truth, but as love. The love that fills us with creation, the love that holds everything together, even though in that high transcendent state it's just love. You don't have to give any of its activities. So it's love with a capital L. Now, because it's complete unity doesn't mean that it's bland. It doesn't mean that it's empty. Bliss is not something like a gruel or a pablum that is always the same. It's something that is filled with meaning. What happens is the reflection of the individuality that experiences that ultimate unity is filled with that love, with that light. And the fact is that all of the people who have the enlightenment do not escape into bliss, but they're filled with meaningful love, and what they do is, with their freedom, they enter into our existence and they help us. In a way, they're free, but in their freedom, they're compelled by love. It's not a compulsion like when we're enslaved to our desires. It's like a compulsion to freedom. It just can't stand in such a way that nothing happens out of it. It's something that has to be live, and so it is perpetually active. Even in small doses, when we have little intuitive realizations, they're almost like the opening chapter of On the Road by Jack Kerouac. He says, this story is so beautiful, it has to be told. It really isn't, but it's that feeling. You're filled with something, and you have to share it. Now, the principle of cause and consequence, as we mentioned before, is sometimes called the principle of necessity. This is so because consequence follows cause, and it must be that way because they are two phases or two poles of the same action. We also mentioned last time that it is called the principle of action. Ela or Sharid can correct me, but the word karma means action. So, the principle of necessity is a precipitate of freedom. It is that necessity. I hate to use the word compulsion, but it is the compulsion that love in freedom uses to share itself and to objectify itself and to know itself. Therefore, it has to be integral to freedom. The principle of cause and consequence is in freedom in the same way that the colors are in sunlight. You can take them out. You can precipitate them out by using a prism or something like that. But they actually come from the one light. Similarly, the principle of cause and consequence is a precipitate of a unified singular truth. The only difference is that singular truth, that with that love, with that creativity, it must share itself. Now, it isn't always an active love. It's a love of life, and it's a love of experience. We've had that. Not quite like falling in love, but when you have an agape experience, when you love everybody around you and it's a love fest, it isn't really active, but it's like an overflow. The character of the life spirit in its unity and its universality, in its need to create and produce through the law, is something that's like overfull all the time. It's always filled with surplus, and it just has to pour things out. By now we're very far afield from human law, which we're trying to get at, so we'll have to get back to that. And we'll come back to the idea of the life spirit along the way, not in this talk, in the next theme talk or so. A few minutes ago we said that human law was self-governance. Self-governance in recognizing that each of us shares a common spirit, and that we are individual foci of that common spirit, and we each have free agency in that common spirit. And in this sense, human law is intended to be something like the legs on a centipede, that each one moves in such a way so that it doesn't stumble over all of the others. Sort of like there's a harmony between them all. Now, in ideal, human law could be just as perfect as the love that precipitates it. It would be congruent, or it would be identical with the way the universal spirit precipitates the law and everything under it. It would be perfectly logical, and it would be born at the same time that the logic was born. In the same way that in every action, the cause and consequence are born at the same time the action is born. It would be perfectly harmonious, and it would be a simultaneous activity. But if we look in the world around us, it isn't like that. It isn't like that at all. Even if we look for the good in the most positive way possible, we see in human creations all kinds of things that are out of harmony with nature, even destructive to nature. More than that, we see intentional malice, evil and immorality, if you will, to other beings. So human law and the need to correct behavior, it indicates that human law is certainly not coincident with divine law. Now, part of the reason for that is that we are tyros at creation. We're utter beginners. We're not capable of conceiving with the divine imagination and carrying that divine unity and its universal perspective through even into our little deeds. In a way, our behavior is something like a little teeny tiny child coloring with colors. It's just scribbles all over the place. Even if if it's a coloring book where the lines are there. But that's not all of it. It's sad to say, but some of our misguided actions and the law under which we work, some of the laws we have are very unjust. Some of it is an intentional perversion. as we individually grow up, we can free ourselves from human law and always obey it. And we can approach divine justice by living within it. We have seen that in this play. The Duke fulfills the letter of the law, but he does it with grace. Everything comes out right. Angelo doesn't have to die. Nobody is killed under the law. That is sort of an ideal for us. That's what we're aiming for in the future. Now we have to make a big correction, because these talks have to be linear. Can't go several directions at the same time. We have to correct, come back and correct. Now, just a very few moments ago, we said something to the effect that human law is not exactly congruent with divine law. It's out of sync. In a way that's untrue. Or at least it needs to be restated in a different way in order for it to be made true. It's actually impossible to act outside of divine law. The very deed of acting itself, in its birth or in its conception, has to be within the law. Every action, no matter what it is, has to have its equal and opposite reaction. No matter what our intent is, or our motive, no matter how well or how poorly we execute, consequences are reflected perfectly in their causes. They reflect the immaturity or the malice, or whatever we're putting out. So we really aren't free from divine law, only we still have the ideal of making all of our human creations and actions such that they fit perfect to the ideal, to the way that God's, or the way that God creates through the law. So even subtle nuances are reflected in cause and consequence. And it has to be that way, because the consequence is just cause from another viewpoint. It's just another pole of the cause. The two poles are within the unity that we've been speaking about. Now, this still doesn't nullify the statement that we are nascent creators and that our creations are very imperfect. It doesn't nullify that at all. Whether it's sinful or not, crude creations are going to have crude consequences, as they must. So this leads us to have to clarify the statement about causes and consequences being ugly and out of harmony, and even with intentional malice. If we consider intentional malice, it's not due to creative immaturity. And it's not due to a lack of skill alone. It is due to a perpetual or habitual intentional misperception. We've gotten used to looking at the point of view that is exclusively individual without regard to the universal. Even in the very best case, when actions are initiated from the self, capital S, the higher or spiritual self, if the action does not come with respect to the universal spirit, then adharmony must result. What we're talking about here is a theme that you can hear again and again because it's throughout all of the mysteries. That all consciousness is a consequence of the interaction between the human spirit, the individual, and the life spirit, the common spirit. And we're saying that if we act even in spirit only from the viewpoint of the self, that we skew things and we produce inharmony. When we do so, it's a matter of degree. Some misactions are not just merely an egoistic application. Sometimes actions in good intent, even with an eye to the universal spirit, but not the creative will to carry it out perfectly, can be countermanded or redirected by the malevolent lower nature. We've been askew so long, and we've shut off even awareness of self with a capital L, and we live in this lower personality that we have built sort of a monster in ourselves, a monster that stays hidden and lurking within our being. If actions are initiated from the self, they're less likely to discordancy than if they're initiated from the lower nature. And it's even possible for the lower nature using the stuff of nature, as in nature magic, to initiate causes and consequences. Now, there are really interesting issues in this. Because the lower nature is completely phenomenal, and in some ways it isn't even a being, but it's more like a shadow or a reflection or a complex or a counterfeit of a being, it really doesn't have access to creativity. And if there is evil, it isn't coming from a creative nature, because a creative nature cannot create something evil. It's coming from this totally from this reflective, totally from this separative point of view. This is known in common. If you look in folklore, there's the notion that the devil can't create and the devil can't procreate. Mostly, though, things are deflections from intentions of the higher self. We've all experienced that. We have high-minded notions of things we want to do, and suddenly, somewhere along the line, things enter in, and it isn't what we intended at all. It comes out to be some kind of a mess. It's because hiding within ourselves so that it can operate in that way, this complex of all of our misdeeds hijacks our good intentions and puts them out as something terrible. And the hijacking is sometimes so subtle that we don't even recognize that it's happening. This is why we do concentration exercises, so that when we, in spirit, as creative free agents, want to do something, that we can carry it all the way through without it being deflected by something in our own being or something outside of us. We're completely free when we're disciplined. When we do that, then our creations, especially if they are with an eye to the universal spirit, to the life spirit, they are then, in human sense, perfectly congruent with the way the gods create. Sometimes we set out to do things and we don't even do them. Because if we did, we would have more soul power and be more capable of creations. The lower nature doesn't want to lose the strength that it has usurped and that it has arrogate it to itself, so it's just easy to distract somebody from doing good. This happens to us all the time. It even happens to us that we're so wrapped up in our own stuff that we don't look from the viewpoint of another. Or we don't look from the viewpoint of the ultimate other, the universal spirit. That is, as it's focused in the life spirit. So this is why, if we're looking from this personal viewpoint, very separate, very outside, this is why there is that admonition. Judge not, lest ye be judged. For whatsoever ye mete out, with that will ye be meted. Our judgment would be phenomenal judgment. It would be from without, and it would have to be, by its very nature, perforce, it would have to be based on limitations and on imperfections. It would be like the scale or the balance that one used to use in chemistry. I don't think they use them anymore, but when the librations never ceased, it kept going back and forth, and when you got really close into a fraction of a milligram, then you said you had that much. It's always like that. It's never going to be perfect. In this play, the topic came up time and time again. When correction is applied, when is it too much, and when is it too little? And that's what happens when things are from without. When you're judging from an external perspective, which is likely to be subjective, and perhaps even more than subjective, it's very hard to have a true justice. On the other hand, if we look at what the mystics claim, this is claimed by most of the mystics that I've read who have had enlightened experiences. It's claimed, for example, by Christian mystics, by Meister Eckhart. It's claimed by Platonists that when one is in a state of enlightenment, when one is looking from the life spirit, from the unity, through the self, and is doing things, it is impossible to sin. Same words are used identically by the Platonists as by the Christians. This is what's involved in the apparent hypocrisy of Angelo. He judges solely by external standards, by reputation, by authority, by the appearances of things. In fact, in a way, he's inverted. If you look at Angelo, it's a most unusual thing, and it's an inversion that we commonly see in people around us all the time. He thinks from ignorance. He thinks he's safe in ignorance rather than being safe in truth. He thinks if nobody knows and nobody sees what he does with Isabella and the murder of her brother or the execution of her brother, that he will be safe, that he'll be all right. In inner reality, that's impossible. Because in inner reality, you see through everything. You're caught dead to rights, and you can't deny that. In this country, Thomas Jefferson was very aware of this. He believed that the best government was the government that governed the least. And for this reason, he believed that the American Indian tribes had better laws and better government than the Western Europeans. He knew the principle very well. He noted that because of the tribal consciousness, probably the race spirit or the tribal spirit, everyone had the ethos or had the sense of judgment within. And when what was shared was within, it didn't require much enforcement because everybody inwardly was on the same page. Now, this is a very small subset within one tribe, but it shows that even on a small phenomenal level that this principle holds true. Modern Republicans, who are not the Republicans like Thomas Jefferson, and I'm not trying to make a political statement here, try to do the same thing. They want a government that has the least regulation, the least external interference with what people do. But that's not the same thing. That's a laissez-faire. And in that, the powerful people who are very selfish and operate totally from without and don't have the good of other people in mind can prevail and do whatever they want to do. That argument is also a anarchistic argument that is common to the extreme left and it's common to the extreme right. That argument is the government that governs the least is the government that governs the best, but without the internal guidance, without the internal recognition of the truth, of the love, and of the justice. There's something of truth to it, because there's this belief, like the belief in the free market. If you let everything go, everything will take care of itself. Now, obviously, there's some truth to it, but there's obviously a major flaw in it. We all know that if we don't take control of our own lives, if we don't govern our own behavior, and if we work exclusively from a selfishness that is, in a way, innate in our lower personality, we're going to run amok. The internal self-regulation has to be if there is to be ultimate harmony in the cosmos. There may be something true in the laissez-faire argument because there are some limits to other things, and they aren't necessarily the powers of others outside being stronger and keeping us in our place. For example, if you take a car, it's got its own internal limit. No matter what the speed laws are, it can only go so fast. And so there are the limits internally in the external world, so that there is something vaguely true in the laissez-faire argument. But that's not what we see in the world every day. And what we do see is that selfish and greedy people who have power of any kind will use it without regulation. They'll use it as much as they can to their own advantage. Now we have to correct some more again. It isn't meant to give the impression that the without, or that the phenomenal, or that the material world are without value, because that would be grossly untrue. There are some philosophies that think that way. Some go as far as to say that the phenomenal world or matter are completely illusionary. Others even go so far as to say that the external world is evil, and that the more one goes into materiality, the more one is going into evil. They're looking at effects rather than at causes. We're going to mention some of that as we proceed tonight and in other talks, but much of it's going to be bypassed because you can't go into everything. Yeah, I'm greedy. I'd love to go for everything. All we are really saying is that trying to apply an internal function from without just isn't going to work. It cannot work. And this is what has happened in human law. This is one of the reasons that human law is not congruent with divine law, and that the divine intents are not carried out with that same perfection. But again, looking at the Duke, because the Duke does have the wedding of the spiritual with the law of the world, he is able to carry out the material law again from within. What we're saying is basically, but in a much different spirit, what the Bible says when it says, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord," meaning to say that if there's payback, it comes from the Spirit which can administer it correctly and not in human vengeance, like an eye for an eye. When the externalist argument for the law is carried to its extreme, its impossibility and its absurdity become pretty apparent. There are many adherents to this, especially in our time. Usually in our time, the law is so removed from the truth within that it even thinks that the truth within does not exist, except as a concept that is generated from without. It is so removed from spirit that spirit is nothing more than a concept that is generated from without, an unnecessary one at that. Obviously, without spirit, without creativity from within, if there is to be change or novelty or something like that, variability, and it doesn't come from within, it has to come from without in a meaningless way, such as randomness. This is the way the law works today in the world. All the changes that happen in nature are due to randomness. There are a whole bunch of variations of the idea of the law being completely external. But they all come under one name, and that's called determinism. Its thesis is that everything is determined by external law. Everything. It's extremely time-oriented in that everything is determined by something that came before it. In a way, it parallels spiritual thought because there's no beginning, there's no end, there's just ongoing causes and consequences. Now you would think that somebody with this outlook would be very grim and very bleak. But if you've ever run into a full determinist, you know that they're happy that they know that determinism is true. But this is the kind of happiness of ignorance is bliss. I don't know how to say it any other way. Because the obvious flaw in determinism is that thinking that one knows that everything is determined is also determined. You can't get behind it. It's absurdity. Yes, predestination is a religious form of determinism. Yep. The thing that's bothersome is that determinists are not true to their own philosophy. And they're pesky. And they're determined to prove to you that determinism is so. They don't realize that if you get it, that proves that they're wrong. Because you're getting it means that there is a universal truth that is shared between the two of you that can be communicated by a persuasive argument. But if you get it and it's a matter of determinism, they haven't done anything with their argument. It's just that the deterministic factors have caused you to think that you get it. I've been in discussions with determinists that I usually try to tell them that if they had had a different breakfast, they would have a different argument. There is no objective truth that is beyond a sequence of determinations. And if there is no objective truth beyond determinations, there can be no objective verification of determinism. No possibility of communication by argument. Thus, for a determinist to argue, to demonstrate determinism is not only a lie and an absurdity, it is bleak. It's like they have nothing better to do. If determinism were true, one would live in a solipsistic subjectivity. You couldn't love someone because you didn't know that there was somebody out there to love that was different from you, and that you were free to give and care about somebody. It's not a very pleasant life. Well, we've probably more than sufficiently talked about the extremes of cause and consequence without grace, without love. So let's return to what we began last time and look at some of the fundamental questions we've been asking about cause and consequence in relation to the love or in relation to the truth. Let's try to do it in ways that are beneficial, that we can see in our lives, and that we can become more creative about it. We have 4 questions or issues or propositions that we're stating as questions or issues. We answered very briefly the first 2 of them last time. We'll go over them again, but from a slightly different way. The first question we asked is, how do we know that cause and consequence are connected? From what we've just seen from the determinist point of view, an empirical or outer answer, even when it is as precise as science is now, has to be inadequate. Because all we have are separate percepts, bundles of experience, and we never actually see the causal relationship. We see a cause, we see an effect, but we don't see the causal relationship. From an empirical point of view, it's a gigantic assumption. And funny as it may seem, it's an act of faith. So that even the materialists from without have their own acts of faith. Now we could say that we know that cause and consequence are connected because we intuitively know it's true. That's a very good argument. However, it ends the discussion immediately, as intuition always does. Sometimes, if we have to act on something for moral good, and then the argument immediately is the best thing to do. You intuitively know what to act on, and you act on it immediately, and you don't ponder it all anymore. However, since we would have no more talk tonight, unless the interface between reason and intuition is well established, as it is in logic or mathematics or something like that, appeals to intuition, except if we're feeling them from within, don't go very far philosophically. They work well for mathematicians. If a mathematician has demonstrated a very elegant proof of something and says, well, this is intuitively true, it works well because there is that very good interface between the human spirit and the life spirit. Yeah. That could also be history. So what we did last time, and what we'll do again, is what philosophers always do when they have an insoluble dilemma. They restructure the question. And we did it in terms of conjectural logic. Dad, oh my goodness, we're going to be out here quickly. No, we are. I planned this one to not be more than 90 minutes and probably more like an hour and 15. We stated the question as a matter of conjecture. If cause and consequence are connected, what does that imply? And that turned out to be very fruitful because we inferred from that if cause and consequence are connected, it means that they have something in common. Something more subtle, something that transcends cause and consequence and is inclusive of both of them. Inclusive of all activity, including thought, including ideas. We concluded that the reason we could be so certain about causal connections is because at some level of our being, we are part of that universality that is within cause and consequence, within ideas, within everything that is tied together. There is something in us that is greater than ourselves, and it is reflected in us. We mentioned mystics who have consciously experienced that, and we mentioned that in Rosicrucian philosophy it's called life spirit. That's what Rudolf Steiner calls it. Life spirit. We mentioned that it was continuous spirit, and that it was actually the stuff of which our intuitions, which are brief bursts of experience, are composed. This is extremely important because this means that there is meaning and purpose behind every creative deed and every intentional action of our lives. And even behind some of those that are engendered from lower levels where energy runs free or is not deliberate. This is exceedingly important in our daily lives because it means we can live creative lives. And that we can live lives that are more efficient and that are to higher purpose. By appealing more to intuition and carrying the stuff of intuition all the way through. No, there can't be a bad motive if we're drawing on the stuff of life spirit. So we see from this that contemplation, which is the exercise of experiencing life spirit, is more than just an exercise. And it's more than an escape and it's more than a toner of our character, our general personality, because this is what brings truth and creativity and spiritual purpose to everything we do. The second proposition as a question that we considered was, when does a cause become an effect, or when does a cause become a consequence? This proposition has its own difficulties because there are all different kinds of causes, greater and lesser. Some causes are vertically antecedent. They can create whole sub-realms that have their own horizontal causes and consequences within them. Even within the compound world in which we live, which is an interblending of several antecedent levels of consciousness, there are temporal problems. Some causes become consequences in a trice, and some take eons. If we take the entire creation, it's one cause. We took the classical approach to this, answering this proposition as a question, because the classical approach seems to be true. Causes become consequence in events, in deeds. This is tantamount to saying that actions which produce events change things from a potential state to an actual state. An actual means of act. This is where the fruitfulness in the active life varies from the contemplative life, which may not be fruitful. We may indeed, even in our own little way, live in bliss and in cosmic escapism and contemplate all sorts of things that never come to birth, that we never act on. It is said in a strict biblical sense that under the law, all must die. That's a statement of fact and not the generation of law. Romeo and Juliet died, and when they died, peace was born. That was a fact, or an actualization of their death. Shakespeare calls sex the little death, and yet in itself results in the birth of something new. A child. It also results in a bigger death, and in the preoccupation of bringing ourselves deeper into the material world through the little death, we become more aware of the big death without a vision of the life beyond it. Astrologically speaking, potential is ruled by Scorpio. And its ruler, one of its co-rulers, is Pluto. So sex and death and potential die together when the other co-ruler, Mars, brings about action. Meaning to say, a potential dies to becoming actual when we take action. Very simple. Mars is exalted in Capricorn, which is, in Oriental astrology, the sign of karma. Time and the execution of acts and causality are isometric. the same thing. All time is measured in terms of events. Whether it is astronomical events or whether it's an atomic clock, all time is understood by events. Thus, things become realized or actualized or effected by actions in time. What is realized is more than phenomenal events, which are only the necessary vehicles for more important things. In one way or another, all the mystery schools, Eastern and Western, teach that consciousness is born of the interplay of the human spirit and the life spirit. The self and the unity beyond self in the universal spirit. Time, as we have seen, is in the sphere of separate deeds. That's the way time is defined. Eternity is of the Logos, which is another name for that unity beyond self. The unity within which cause and consequence are united. Thus, our waking consciousness, very important thing, our waking consciousness is a consequence of deeds, of our causes and of our consequences. We understand the meaning and the purpose when they are taken out of potential and actualized. So our consciousness is between the interplay of actions and intuitions, between time and eternity. This is very practically important as well as philosophically important. And it also brings us to the next proposition as a question. And that is, what is the difference between a cause and an effect? Or what is the difference between a cause and a consciousness and a consequence? In light of what we're saying, it is of magnum importance. It is every day. I don't know how often I've said it. If only I had done that. Or if only I hadn't done that. We've all done or not done things that we say later on, this changes everything. For some, the event of September 11th, 2001, changed everything. For others, it was the death of Caesar that changed everything. For others, it was the incarnation of Christ. Little events of not saying a kind word to somebody who's on the edge of suicide, or the beginning of a great spiritual movement are involved in this. Events change everything. So whether it is a cause being changed to a consequence, it changes everything. Now, to some extent, this proposition or this question is an extension of the last one, and we have already partially answered it, or mostly answered it. Just a very few minutes ago, we said something like, causes become effects through events and deeds. We also said that in events and deeds, things are changed from potential to actual. These imply a number of things, a number remember a very important thing. For a moment, let's drop the whole idea of an ongoing chain of causes and consequences, and let's work instead within a little setting, which is probably not the most topical or scientific word, but it'll work all right. We can extrapolate later if we need to. Suppose somebody's inventing something, whether it's an artistic invention like a poem, or a song, or a technical invention like a tool, or a device of some kind like a can crusher. In the creative setting, one is filled with a creative urge or an impulse. Very exciting. Accompanying that urge is a problem, an unknown, something that needs satisfying. Sometimes it seems like one precedes the other, like the question or the unknown or the problem precedes, but there has to be simultaneity for the creation to come into being. Because they're just different ways of looking at the same thing. Sometimes you experience something and it seems one way, but when you look at it, it seems as if something else came first. What came first is the recognition, not necessarily the reality. So what I'm saying is that the question and the creative impulse in a creative moment occur at the same time. When the creative urges come into being and the whole setting is complete, you can see that there are two stages to it. And each has its own attributes, its own part that it gives to the setting. Before the completion of the event, everything is hypothetical. It's a dream, or it's a potential. After the invention, everything is factual. Everything is precipitated. It's an actuality. Obviously, the former state is causal, and the latter state is effectual or consequential. They're both about the same thing, same creative invention, with very different kinds of consciousness. Causal state is subjective. And like one face of Janus, the god of time, it faces the future. It's always looking ahead. How can I solve this problem? That's one of the difficulties. If one does not carry through an event or an invention or a creative act, you can get stuck. Some people identify with causes, social causes, political causes, religious causes, and what happens is they fall into the same subjectivity that pervades the causal side of the whole event. We all know people who have made something small of themselves by getting lost like that. Sometimes people think that a cause isn't hypothetical but cut and dry. We all fall for that one. We initiate causes and suddenly we get surprised because we think that there's all cut and dried because we didn't maintain the hypothetical questioning attitude about a cause. Happens, things that we do every day. We think we're putting into the same cause into action, but it doesn't work that way. The effectual or the consequential state is objective, not subjective like the causal state. And like the other face of Janus, it faces the past. It's always looking back. History, jurisprudence, science, all of them are looking back at the past. They all depend on precedent. Time of planning, or the time of theorizing, or the time of dreaming is over. Things are changed. They are now objective. In the consequential state, things are a matter of knowledge, not a matter of imagination. You can see people that get stuck in knowledge. You can see people that get stuck in imagination. Some people are lost with the past. They're stuck in the facts. They say the facts are the facts. And when that happens, there's no future. Each side of an event has its upside. It has its potential. And it has its potential pitfall. This is an important thing. Time marches on. Time waits for no one. The law of action goes beyond the little setting. And it doesn't stop. It's not a matter of living in one's dreams, or living on one's laurels from the past. Events are points in time, so to speak. Cause and consequence are all about time. They're not stopping points. They're turning points. We cannot gloss over events. We can use them as toeholds. Let's very briefly look at one more proposition stated as a question, which is much lighter and is much more of an extension of what we've just said. What is implied by the difference between cause and consequence? What is implied by taking something from potential and bringing it into actual? The answer is found throughout the universe. The fact that there is the difference is being the most fundamental difference, where difference begins within unity. Difference means change. Though in all organisms there is a striving for a homeostatic balance, things get done by difference. If things remained only in the life spirit, there would be only equality. But when there is inequality, because the difference between potential and actual, which causes all acts to take place in physics, is what brings change about. So again, it's that same interplay between the unity of the life spirit and the unity of the human spirit, not only that our consciousness is born, but that all change takes place in the universe. Now, there are some philosophies that like permanence. But the fact of the matter is that things change. One side of the difference always seeks its opposite side. In what Carl Jung called in the psychological sense an antiodromia. Cause begs for effect. Effect wants to be reborn in a new cause. So it is a perpetual, ongoing kind of activity. Time means change. Things actually change. And the effects time, consequences change everything. Just like what happens, you drop a plate that we've had for 30 years, changes everything. Yes, that's coming up in future talk. Physicists, in their hypothetical world, in which everything is subjective, say that you can reverse time and its effects. And they can do that in their equation. But that isn't so in actual reality. If you harm someone else, it can't be taken back. Everyone and everything is changed. If you had never heard music, and suddenly you heard music, you could never go back and say, there is such a thing. You could never go back to your asonorous world. You'd have to have music. The biggest and the most important change, which also cannot be changed, or can't be reversed, is the change in consciousness. Cause, consequences, change consciousness. Subjective potential within the absolute is without end, has possibility of ongoing objective consciousness being born out of it. Consciousness in self is changed in relation to truth and in relation to potential. One is awake to new things, and one is more awake. And not only one as a creative free agent, but the one. That is progress. It comes in cosmic action. That's important. Next time we'll begin with King Lear. And you can take some of the books home if you like. If you've got some of the other books, bring them back, and we will, I'll stash them away where they belong. After King Lear, we'll carry all of this thought much further. And then after we do Merchant of Venice, we'll shift, all of this will be shifted into something else. I have one little poem I'd like to read. By one of my favorite authors. It's by Jorge Luis Borges, who, besides being blind, was also never married. He became blind. It was always without a son. It's called To the Sun. He wrote it, I guess, because he didn't have one, so he wrote a poem for his son. It was not I who begot you, it was the dead. My father and his father and their forebearers, all those who through a labyrinth of loves descended from Adam and the desert wastes of Cain and Abel into a dawn so ancient it has become mythology by now, to arrive blood and marrow at this day in the future in which I now beget you. I feel their multitudes. They are who we are, and you amongst us, and you the sons to come that you will beget. The latest in the line in red, latest in the line and in red Adam's line. I too am those others. This is the line. Eternity is present in the things of times, in the things of time and its impatient happenings. Eternity is present in the things of time and its impatient happenings. La eternidad está en las cosas del tiempo que están más